Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Hoot episode. Istio offers very rich Layer 7 traffic management and security policies. Cilium, to my surprise, I actually learned this recently, also offers, as a CNI, Layer 7 policies. And we've got a lot of questions from our user if they still need Istio's Layer 7 policies, if they're going to use, sorry about my phone. We got a lot of questions from our user if they still need Istio's Layer 7 policy, if they use Cilium's Layer 7 policy from Cilium CNI. So in this Hoot live stream, I am so happy to have Yuval join me to help me explain and dive into the differences of the two, particularly focusing on the security aspect. So Yuval, I think most of our audience know you, and many of them actually memorize your voice. But for folks who doesn't know you, can you give a quick intro to them?
Definitely, I'm Yuval Kohavi. I'm the chief architect in solo.io, and I do a little bit of everything in terms of what Solo does. And I'm excited to be back. I had quite a few episodes on the Hoot, so it's nice to be back.
Thank you so much, Yuva. So excited to have you. Definitely love to have you back. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about Cilium's Layer 7 policy. So let me add my screen to the stream. If I'm doing it correctly. All right, looks like I am. So like I explained to everybody, I was just learned as part of Cilium CNI, they do support Layer 7 policy, right? So to the Layer 7 policy, redirect proxy traffic to a Cilium user space proxy instance. So apparently Envoy is used as part of their Layer 7 policy support to help mediate the traffic. So there are even some examples on the Layer 7 policies. So if we go to the Cilium website on Layer 7 policies, so you can configure Layer 7 rules on HTTP, Kafka, and DNS. So for this live stream, we're going to dive into particularly on HTTP because HTTP is the most common Layer 7 policies, and you can see it's you can do from your endpoints, set up ingress rules as part of the Cilium network policy. You can specify port number, and most interesting, you can specify the method and the path as part of the Layer 7 policy out of Cilium network. One other thing I want to share, I find very interesting as I was looking at this, is not only based on label, you can also configure service account in the Layer 7 or even Layer 4 policy, I believe. Please correct me if I'm learning things because I
No,
want to
you're good.
invite you to validate my learning. So feel free anytime, right? So this is an interesting example, right? Not only you specify the endpoint by labels, but you can actually specify service account as part of your from and also the target endpoint. So with that, we are going to do a quick demo on this. Let me go ahead, remove this from stream. And let me go ahead, share my other screen if I'm doing this properly. Great. So this is my Kubernetes cluster. As you can see, I have kind installed. I have a 2-node cluster using so I have worker 1 and worker 2 on my kind cluster, and I have a bunch of pods installed. I have Cilium already installed. Follow the default Cilium installation. I use Cilium to replace the kube proxy. I also have a couple of sample installed in the default namespace. So I have a sleep pod, sleep service, and also a not sleep, and Hello World version 1 and version 2. So the only thing on version 1 and version 2 is version 1 is on a different node than the sleep pod, while version 2 is on the same node as the sleep pod. So for this demo, we're going to explore a little bit on the Cilium policies. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a status command, just making sure you have visibility to my Cilium environment. So as you can see, I have Cilium and its operator installed. I have Hubble and cluster mesh disabled. So we already have the pods installed. So the next thing we're doing is from the sleep pod, we can call the hello word, and also from the not sleep pod, we can also call the hello word, right? Because there's no policy at the moment. So I do have a Cilium layer 4 policies, so which we're going to apply next. So what this policy does is leverage the Kubernetes service account construct in the selectors. So it essentially says, I'm going to allow from sleep to hello world on the port 5000 for any of the TCP traffic. So let's go ahead, apply this policy, right? So with this policy applied, what's interesting is Cilium generates the endpoint object and also identity objects that can be used for this policy. So if you're looking into a little bit information of the endpoint object, you can see a little bit more information about any of the endpoints. For example, the first endpoint is the hello world. So it captures the endpoint from Cilium's perspective along with the identity information. As you can see, the identity is pretty much based on labels at this point. So now that we apply our policy, let's continue to try to reach from sleep to hello, right? So remember what policy is, we are going to allow from sleep to hello on port 5000. So this continue work, which is expected. But let's see if we, what if we access from not sleep, right? So in this case, it's on a different service account. By the way, I forgot to mention the not sleep pod was using a different service account, which is also called not sleep, while the sleep pod was using the service account sleep. So this is what you expect on the layer 4 network policy, which essentially blocking this traffic, right? So this is not surprising, not a great experience where, your request just hang there, but it's kind of expected. So let's take a look of a layer 7 policy I have in my environment. I'm going to apply to my environment, excuse me. So in this example, it's pretty much the same as before, right? The only thing is I'm adding a rules, that's HTTP rules. And I'm saying, on this particular port, I'm going to also allow, I'm only going to allow a get method call to /hello and nothing else, right? So let's go ahead, apply this layer 7 policy. So we got our policy applied, and the next thing we're going to do is to do a couple of commands just to check, are we allowed to access to this hello world from sleep? And are we allowed to access from sleep to hello world, but on /hello3, which is not a path that's supposed to be allowed? Also, are we allowed to access from not sleep? So let's hit enter on this. So as you can see, the first one runs through, which is from sleep to hello world on /hello. The second one, we actually get a really nice message, access denied. So I love that message. So essentially it's telling us we're not accessing a path that's being allowed. The third one, there was no feedback to us, same as the layer 4 policy. So, we just didn't get anything. So with that, I'm going to cancel this out. And one other thing I want to show is I do have my pod information captured. So in this case, I have this pod configured to a Cilium pod, which is this particular one. So what we're going to do is dive a little bit deeper into, what are the process running on this Cilium pod, right? How is the layer 7 works, right? In this case, so how does Cilium knows to say, I'm going to allow a get request on /hello from the sleep pod, the service account associated with any pod that associated with sleep. So as you can see, there is a Cilium Envoy actually running. In fact, we can actually dump the configurations on this Envoy. So if we do a config dump, we can get all the configurations on this Envoy. One thing interesting here, Yuval, you are the Envoy expert. Feel free to correct me if I'm append anything. So one thing interesting is that there is a layer 7 policy, which is an HTTP filter as part of the Envoy configuration for TLS traffic. I believe there's also another one for the plain traffic, the raw buffer.
Yeah, the TLS is for a different feature that we didn't cover.
Yeah, do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
So
on the layer 7 policy from Cilium?
Yeah, sure. I can elaborate on that. So the way, maybe I'll start by describing kind of how it works, and then we can go into a discussion of kind of pros and cons of this approach versus Istio's approach. Does that sound like a good structure?
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. And obviously, if there's any questions from the audience, I love answering them, so feel free to send them at any time. So the way Cilium achieves layer 7 is whenever it detects you have an L7 policy in your network policy, it spins up an Envoy proxy and transparently proxies traffic to it, right? So you have one Envoy proxy per node that interprets and applies the L7 policy. Envoy uses XDS to not only get its regular configuration, it also gets these Cilium L7 policies from the Cilium control plane, and the Cilium filter evaluates the policies and applies them to traffic. So basically, traffic that's meant to go into a pod goes into Envoy instead, and then as it leaves Envoy, it will go into a pod. That's kind of the general structure of how this works versus in Istio, where the policy is evaluated in the sidecar using a filter that was upstream to Envoy, the RBAC filter, that apply RBAC rules and uses that to authorize requests based on the SPIFE identity of a request, or it could be other properties as well.
So are you saying this particular filter is not upstream to Envoy yet?
That I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know about that. Yeah. So one other command, actually, Dini taught me to run this is if you want to try to understand the content of the layer 7 policy from Cilium. So there is this command that's a little bit more complicated. It's essentially send this request to the Cilium XDS service, right? And it's trying to trying to find a little bit more information about the network policies the layer 7 policy is trying to use.
Yeah, so what you're doing right now is kind of emulating what Envoy does and contacting the control plane, asking it to deliver the network policies to you. This is essentially a very simple implementation of the XDS protocol.
Yeah, interesting. Unfortunately, this command runs pretty slow, but I do have the output captured, I believe, from an early run I have. Let me see if I have it somewhere. I think I have it. Okay, so I have the config dump. Maybe actually, no, it's in the temp directory. Yeah, that's why. Oh, maybe not. I guess it's been overwritten. Yeah. So I guess we'll show this when this is running, after this finishes running. Okay, anything else? I think that's the demo I have from a Cilium perspective on the layer 7 policy. As you can see, it's relatively flexible, right? It's pretty simple to use. But from what I can tell, it's not using mutual TLS. It's not to do the TLS handshake from pods, from, I guess, my sleep to the hello world.
Yeah, and I can expand on that if you like.
Yes, please.
So the way Cilium works by default, and I'm not talking about IPsec or WireGuard modes, I'm just talking about the default mode without encryption. Basically, the pods go into an eBPF map naturally because it's an eBPF-based data path.
Mm-hmm.
And the policies are executed in eBPF, right? But in order to make it kind of manageable, you don't want a policy per pod. That's why they allocate identities to pods based on, whatever pod properties. It could be label, service account, whatnot. And in fact, if you can scroll up to that earlier where you showed the identities and the pods, you can see that identity is basically an integer, right? So the way it works is that when Cilium receives a connection from a pod, it looks up its identity in the map, right? It has what's called it caches the pod, as we said. So it looks up the pod IP and converts it to the identity, and then uses this identity to run policy, right? And that means the source of the identity is not a cryptographic primitive, right? It's actually the network identity, the IP of the pod, right? So it has some issues around eventual consistency, has less strong guarantees than a cryptographic identity. So that's kind of where you have to weigh the pros and cons for yourself. So for example, if you're concerned with someone in the cluster spoofing a pod IP address, or if you're concerned with eventual consistency, where if you have high churn environment where pods can go up and down very quickly, that might be something to think about when you implement a network-based approach to identity. Not to say that you shouldn't do it. I think defense in depth is great. But you should also consider the stronger guarantees that cryptographic identity provides. So let's compare that with the way it's done in Istio. In Istio, a service account token that is provisioned by Kubernetes is exchanged for a client certificate. And now the client certificate is used for identity. So even if the pod IP, it doesn't change. But even if it would, even if something happens, you cannot mistake the identity for anything else because it's embedded in the network connection itself. The connection would not be made with a wrong identity, if that makes sense. I hope that was a clear explanation. These are very complex topics, and I try to kind of simplify them. But basically, the way Cilium gets its identity is using the pod IP, which it translates to the identity that we saw above, and then uses that to run policies.
Mm-hmm. I guess the one thing I found interesting as you were talking about this is with Cilium, right? Because it's IP based, right? As the IP changes, I assume your identity would actually change. With Istio, you know, your paths could have the same identity, right? For the same service, even maybe it's deployed into different cluster or virtual machine, right? Because it could be the same identity for that particular service.
So here the identity is kind of something that Cilium manages. You create network policies, and or Cilium network policies for that matter, and then Cilium kind of infers the identity for you, which is nice. Um, in Istio, the identity is always the service account,
Yep.
right? So the way it works with Cilium kind of allocates, because they need to store everything in eBPF maps. You can't just have arbitrary constructs. It basically distills the properties of the identity into an integer. It needs to obviously save it on the cluster to make sure all the nodes agree on it, and then maps pod IPs into these identities. There are edge cases, like I said before, if you're concerned about spoofing or a high churn rate where the map might not update in time. But for the most part, like for the vast majority of network flows, it'll work fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, by the way, my output is back now. So I assume these are the network policies that the Cilium layer 7 policy that we saw early in the Envoy config. That's this is it's consumed.
Exactly. So the filter you showed earlier in the config dump, inside of Android, there's a separate cache that caches these objects, and that's what the filter uses to run the policy. And this is kind of equivalent to how the eBPF work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
all right.
The L7 part. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the L7 part. All right, let's show a quick demo of Istio. I know you talk about Istio with the neutral TLS cryptographic. So let me show a quick demo of Istio. If I can get my Istio environment running. All right. So this is my Istio environment. I deployed a Kubernetes cluster with Istio installed in the cloud. So on my environment, I have, so I have a bunch of pods deployed, but I didn't have the sidecar injection enabled. So the first thing I'm going to do is enable Istio injection on my default namespace. And then I want to deploy all the samples again, right? The same exact samples with sleep, not sleep, and hello world version 1 and version 2. The only difference here is my cluster is pretty small, so I only have one node. So you're going to see hello version 1 and version 2 running on the same node. But otherwise, the sample is exactly the same. It's just a capacity issue. So my pods are running now. So the first thing I want to do is, so in Istio, everything is allow you access by default because Istio has permissive enabled by default. So the first thing we're going to do is enable mutual TLS, which is one of the Istio security policy, and we'll enable mutual TLS on this particular namespace, which is the default one. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get to the sleep pod. So we're going to do, if I can remember the command correctly. So we're going to exec into the sleep pod, and we're going to run a command to OpenSSL command. Let me see if it has OpenSSL command. Okay, so I think I need to get to the Istio proxy. It should have OpenSSL. Yeah. So okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the OpenSSL command. Sorry, it's running pretty fast because I did a copy. So to connect to the hello world on port 5000 and ask for the certs, right? So when the client connect to the server, it's going to ask the server, what is your certificate, right? Because this is how mutual TLS work, right? I ask for the server certificate, and server also ask for the client certificate. When mutually the certificate is coming from the trusted chain, then they can establish the connection. So if you do a little bit digging into the certificate, which let's do that. So let me, from my machine, what I'm going to do is copy the certificate. Sorry, let me see. So if you, so let me see if I can get this right. So if I can copy the certificate, and if I can copy this certificate over, I'm not sure copy paste works really well on this environment, but the idea is I want to kind of show you what the certificate looks like, because last time I do it, I actually did it on my machine. Actually, this probably not going to work. Yeah, the reason is this machine doesn't have step installed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change to my other window so that you can see my terminal. So let me bring up my terminal here. Sorry about that hiccup. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to copy the certificate over, and the certificate is from the show certs command, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the certificate over, because I have step on my machine. I should have installed on the other terminal too, but I don't at the moment. So once the certificate is copied over, we're going to step into the certificate and inspect the certificate, and then just check the identity of the certificate, right? What is the specific identity? How the certificate is generated and all that. Sorry, it's pasted very slow. I need to modify my shell to be a little bit faster. All right, hopefully that's it. So step certificate inspect, and this is my certificate for the server certificate, right? So you can see it's actually expiring in a day, right? This is today and tomorrow, and you can tell the SPIFFE ID, which is the hello word, right? So that's how mutual TLS work in the Istio environment. That you have a very strong identity between your client and your server side. So going back to my other screen now, let's go back to my other screen. Yep. So we walk through the certificate, right? So we were able to confirm that server side is the hello world certificate, and the server side is also going to do similar and confirm the client side is also the certificate from the sleep. One thing Istio does Istio have authorization policy, which we recommend people start with now nothing in a particular mesh or namespace, while you then gradually enable things as needed. So for instance, I denied allow nothing in my default namespace, and you can see from sleep to hello now it's not accessed. With Istio, you can configure authorization policy to allow specific source, right? Very similar to what we will review from Cilium. You can base on the principal based on service account, and you can match to whichever label that has hello word, and you can say I'm only going to allow a get method. So with that supplied, if you do a curl command to hello, you can find out it's continue to working. But if you do it from not sleep to hello, you can find out we get RBAC access denied immediately, right? So this is how Istio works with the cryptographic information between your client and your server, and allows you to build authorization policies on top of the identities built into Istio that's service-based.
Yeah, and I'll emphasize it's not just the fact that there is a certificate by itself, it's also how they got the certificate. So it's starting with the service account. So you know it really represents a service account. A pod cannot just get a certificate for any service account it wants. It must present a valid service account token to Istio, then that gets exchanged to the certificate.
That's a great point. Yeah, in fact, the service account, I believe it's mounted to the Istio proxy. So it does all this work to send the request to the Istio control plane, get the certificate. And it also takes care of rotation, right? Because every 24 hours, it's going to be expiring. So it continues making sure you have the right certificates that's valid.
Exactly. And in this case, the pod that requests a certificate from Istio, it actually sends something called a CSR. The main distinction here that the pod never sends the private key to its certificate.
Yeah.
So that always stays in the pod. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess we've gone through a review, a quick demo of Cilium's Layer 7 policy. We've also gone through a quick demo of Istio's Layer 7 policy. So Yuval, I'd like to kind of get into the comparison phase. I mean, we talk about the comparison along the way, but it might be good to summarize a little bit and dive into particular area as you think makes sense.
Yeah, and I see we also got a question.
Oh yeah, yes, Faye. Hi.
I think it's a great timing. It's related to the exactly discussion we're about to have.
Yeah, so thank you, Faye, for that question. So the question is, would it be safe to say, because Istio have a stronger identity based on service account and SPIFFE, it will be better to use as layer 7 policy, while leave Cilium to enforce at layer 3?
So the way I see it, it's kind of two distinct things. Once you got an identity, the issue is not necessarily L7 or not. The issue is that you need to know that the identity is really what it is, right? And with a cryptographic identity, you cannot, in any reasonable means, go around it. Where with a network-based identity, depending on the implementation, there is a chance of confusion, right? And I'm not saying it's the common sense, and I'm not saying that it's likely, but it's not zero either, right? Versus a cryptographic identity where, it's cryptographically proven that the connection you're processing is the correct identity. So that's kind of the first point of comparison, right? So the identity is kind of, and again, I'm talking about Cilium in the basic mode without encryption, which is how the default where you deploy it. Identity is based on network properties, IPs. How do you derive the identity of a connection? So on one side it's kind of IP based, network based. On the other side is on Istio side is cryptographic based. And the other point, and now I'll talk a little bit about L7, is that with Istio, L7 policy is evaluated on every pod, and in Cilium it evaluated on a node, right? So you have a single envoy on a node that processes all the L7 policies of pods on that node. Now again, there's trade-offs, right? So on Istio's approach, you need an envoy on every pod, right? You might incur more RAM costs versus the per node case. But now you have an envoy on a node that's doing L7 processing for multiple identities. And if you look at the envoy CVE list, you'll see that the most high severity CVEs are in L7. Right. So again, I'm not
Yes,
saying
absolutely.
yeah, and I'm not saying there's a security issue right now. I'm not saying it's definitely not secure, and it's about probabilities, right? The probability of an issue with L7 that does multi-tenancy in terms of policy, because it evaluates policies for multiple identities, all the identities on the node, to having an issue here there is higher than an issue impacting a single envoy that only does the identity for one, only does policy for the one identity it's assumes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we work in the Istio product security work group, and probably 95% of Envoy security vulnerability are related to layer 7 processing. Yeah. And I think that's one perspective. The other thing, if you think about WASM, right, the extension of running WASM for maybe for one of your pod purposes, but the fact that you are doing a multi-tenancy envoy, wouldn't that impact anyone else on the node too?
Yeah, so for example, if you want to use WASM to implement a custom policy, and it's not something that Cilium currently supports, but just for the sake of argument, you probably wouldn't want to do it on a per node basis on L7, right? And the reason is because the reason you use that WASM to begin with is to have flexibility and autonomy to your teams, right? So you can have each team kind of have their own rules that are custom to their business use case. The problem is that WASM filters are Turing complete, and they, if you have an infinite loop in a WASM filter, now Envoy is stuck, right? And you don't want a situation where one team has a bug in the code and another team is impacted because you have a single envoy on the node that does all the L7 processing. So you want to be very careful when you're doing multi-tenancy in L7 on the node level. You want to be very careful in what you do there, because it's easy to kind of, in L7 especially, because it's a lot more complex than L4. It's very easy to do things you don't want to do.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing I was talking to Yuval before we chat is, so I think you covered about the encryption, right, between the nodes in Cilium's environment, right? So essentially, you don't get encryption by default, which is what I showed you in my environment, and you could potentially enable WireGuard in Cilium to do encryption, or you can enable IPsec. But if you do WireGuard, for instance, is one of the common way. If you go to the limitations, layer 7 is actually not supported, right? So if you want encryption with WireGuard, you can't really use layer 7 policy, at least based on the latest documentation.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, I've also heard people talking about like FIPS compliance for WireGuard. I think the crypto module used by WireGuard, there's no plan to be FIPS compliant. So if you are a user, Faye, I think you probably are, that cares about FIPS compliant, that's something, you want to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, MTLS is used everywhere, right? From
Yeah.
phone, cloud, it's kind of ubiquitous, so it's more compliant, not just with FIPS, with a bunch of other standards that I'm not even sure if IPsec is FIPS compliant, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, but I think you made an interesting point about mutual TLS being everywhere, right? So that's important, right? Because you're not just going to have your services running in Kubernetes. In fact, you may have your services running on VM or maybe some other mixed hybrid environment, right? Using something that's everywhere, it's just so much easier to enable your communication among your services.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Anything else you want to add as far as how do they compare? I remember you mentioned about eventual consistency before.
Yeah, so that was related one of the edge cases where a network cache-based identity approach might fail. So imagine you have two nodes, and they each need to maintain a cache that maps network IPs to identities, right?
Mm.
And they get that cache or they update the cache by observing, by watching the Kubernetes API server. Uh, and that as soon as you have more than two components kind of working in the network, you get into eventual consistency problems, right? So it could be that one endpoint will process the data faster than the other, and now you have inconsistent caches. And now again, in normal deployments, this reconcile very fast. But when you build your thread model, when you think about this stuff, you kind of have to take these edge cases into account.
So this could happen when pods are deployed rapidly and
Exactly. So if you have pods coming and going, in Kubernetes, pods can reuse IP addresses. So you can have a pod dying and a new pod being created that gets the IP of the old pod, but has a different identity. Now, again, usually this whole thing propagates very fast to the different controllers, but there's no guarantee that it will, right? And again, talking about edge case, you got to take into account when you build a thread model, this is one of them. It could be that due to the slow propagation of the new pod information to the Cilium agent, that it will kind of update the cache at a later point, and now you can have a case of mistaken identity. So it's not something that normally would happen, and I don't think it should prevent you from using network policies. But it's something you do need to take into account, and it's something that we definitely encourage in Solo is to do defense in depth.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, right? So you have CNI layer provide you the layer 3 and layer 4 policy, and then have the mutual TLS cryptographic provided by surface mesh like Istio.
Exactly. And I think that way you kind of, it's a win-win, right? You have, if one of them fails, the other will catch it.
Yeah, totally. And it's best practice for zero trust network too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Is there anything else you want to add? This has been great discussion about how they compare from the angle for interoperability, encryption, mutual TLS, security, and multi-tenancy, and eventual consistency.
I think we covered a good amount. If happy to answer any questions if there's any from our audience, but otherwise, I don't have more to add here, at least for today. I think it's a lot of material.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of material. I think I may have to rewatch it myself too. So thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions, please send them along. If not, we are available on Solo Slack. You can always hit me or Yuval. Feel free to start a discussion with us. I want to thank you for so much, for coming back to the hood where you started and also answer a bunch of questions and validate my thoughts around Cilium Layer 7 policy with Istio's Layer 7 policy. So, folks, if you guys find this interesting, please give us a thumbs up and also subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future episodes. So we can learn together on these cloud native technologies related to Istio, Envoy, Cilium, eBPF, and GraphQL. And hope to see you guys next Tuesday. Thank you, Yuval. Thanks everybody for joining. Bye.